She handed it to me on a Saturday morning in April, folded into thirds like a business memo. And I want you to picture that for a second before I go any further. A woman 31 years old, standing in the kitchen I'd owned since Clinton's first term, presenting me with a list of rules for living in it. Her name is Denise. She's married to my son Marcus. And she said, "Frank, we've talked about it, and we wrote down a few things that'll help the house run better." I took the paper, I unfolded it. There were 8 items. Quiet hours after 9. The garage was for their cars now, both bays, so I'd need to park on the street. Thermostat capped at 68 inches winter to save on the bill. A grocery contribution of $340 a month. My dog wasn't allowed past the kitchen into the living room anymore because Denise was managing her allergies. And the last one, the one she'd underlined, said any overnight guests, meaning my daughter when she visits, needed 48 hours notice and approval from both of them. I read every line. I folded it back along her crease. I handed it to her. And I said, "Before you put that up on the refrigerator, Denise, go check the mailbox. There's something out there for you." She looked at me the way people look at you when the sentence didn't match the moment. I said it again. Same words, same flat tone I used to use on job sites when a foreman wanted to argue about a load-bearing wall. She walked to the front door. I heard it open. I heard the mailbox creak, the one I'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. I heard paper, then nothing, then the door again, and she came back into that kitchen a different woman than the one who'd walked out of it 40 seconds earlier. My name is Frank Delacroix. I'm 68 years old. I've lived in this house on Bayou Terrace outside Lafayette, Louisiana since 1994, and what my daughter-in-law didn't know when she handed me her list of house rules on a Saturday morning was that I'd been to see my attorney 19 days earlier, and that the certified letter waiting in that mailbox had been sitting there since Thursday, delivered by the Postal Service a full 2 days before she ever printed her rules. She'd brought me her list. I'd sent her to get mine. Let me back up. Because you need to understand who I am before you understand what I did, and you need to understand who my wife was, because none of this happens without her. I spent 34 years as a master electrician and then a contractor, running Delacroix Electric out of a 2-bay shop on Pinhook Road that I opened in 1985 with a used van and $4,000 I'd borrowed against a life insurance policy. Electrical work teaches you one thing above everything else, and it's this. Current doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care if you meant well. It follows the path it's given. And if the path is wrong, somebody gets hurt, and it's usually not the person who wired it wrong. I built that business into 11 employees at its peak, wired half the strip malls between Lafayette and Broussard, and sold it in 2019 to a young electrician who'd worked under me for 11 years and earned every bit of the price we agreed on. What I hadn't finished by 2019 was the house. My wife Yvonne and I bought it in '94 with a yard full of Louisiana clay and a kitchen the previous owners had painted a color she called hospital green, and we spent 29 years turning it into something that was unmistakably hers. Yvonne Delacroix was a labor and delivery nurse for 26 years at Lafayette General. And if you want to know what kind of person reads a room in 4 seconds flat, it's a nurse who spent 3 decades telling frightened people the truth gently. She could look at a family in a waiting room and tell you which member was lying about how fine everything was. She turned that same eye on our own family without ever making it feel like surveillance, which is its own kind of skill, and one I never had. She kept a journal. Not a diary, a journal, spiral-bound, kept in the drawer of her nightstand, where she wrote down things she noticed and didn't yet know what to do with. After she passed, I found 6 of them going back to 2015. The last one, from 2021, the year before her diagnosis, had 11 entries about Marcus and Denise. She hadn't shown them to me. Not because she was hiding it, because she told me once, "Frank, I write it down when I see it, and I decide what it means later, when there's enough of it to mean something." She was 3 months from deciding, I think, when the pancreatic cancer took her in November of 2022. 4 months from symptom to funeral. Sudden is the word people reach for, and it's the right one, because there wasn't a version of that year where I had time to prepare. The house became mine, the way a house becomes yours, when the person you built it with is gone completely, and wrongly, both at once. I haven't moved her reading lamp. I haven't touched the arrangement of the living room furniture, which she'd rearranged in 2018 after we redid the floors and declared, with the finality of a woman who did not reconsider such declarations, That's it. That's where it lives now. She was right. She was always right about rooms. I've kept up her rose beds along the side fence, exactly the way her notebook said to, pruning in February, feeding in April, because even a man who never once picked up a pair of shears before she died can follow good instructions if they're written down clearly enough, and hers always were. I had 2 children. My daughter Renee is 36, lives in Houston, works as a physical therapist, and drives in every 6 weeks or so without me having to ask, because that's who she is. She'd been telling me since the spring of 2023. In the gentle, roundabout way people tell you something they know will land hard, that something about Marcus's situation wasn't sitting right with her. Marcus is 41. He's a good-hearted man in a lot of ways. But he's spent his adult life catching one idea after another, the way some men catch colds, a food truck that lasted 8 months, a solar panel sales job, a stretch trying to flip houses with a partner who disappeared with the earnest money. He called each one the next thing instead of what it actually was, which was the last thing not working out. He married Denise in 2019. Denise is 31, works as a regional operations manager for an insurance claims office. And she is, without question, the most organized and capable person I've met in years. She is not cruel. I want to be fair about that, because I've thought about it a great deal since. She's efficient, and I came to learn, slower than Yvonne would have, that for Denise, efficiency and love had somehow become the same instrument, so that every room, every schedule, every relationship got measured by what it produced. They moved into the house in March of 2023, 4 months after Yvonne died. Marcus was between things again, and there'd been trouble with their apartment lease he didn't want to explain, and I didn't push, because pushing would have gotten me an answer I wasn't ready to carry. I offered the 2 back bedrooms. I'd been alone in that house 4 months, and the quiet had a weight to it I hadn't expected. Heavier some nights than the noise of 2 extra adults and their moods would ever be. So I said yes. That calculation started to change within about a year, and it didn't change because of one moment it changed the way rust changes a hinge, so slow you don't notice until the door won't swing right anymore. In June of 2023, Denise reorganized the kitchen while I was in Houston visiting Renee for a long weekend. Not thrown into chaos, reorganized with intention. Yvonne's spice rack, alphabetized by her own hand for a decade, got replaced by one sorted by cuisine, for efficiency. The good knives moved to a drawer by the stove because that was more logical. I put the spice rack back the day I got home. Denise didn't say anything, neither did I. In September, at dinner, she mentioned that the living room furniture wasn't working for how the space actually got used, and she had some ideas. She framed it as a helpful thought, the way she framed most things. It was the room Yvonne had arranged in 2018 and called finished. I told Denise it was staying the way it was. She said, "Sure, just a thought." It didn't come up again out loud, but I noticed her eyes doing the math on that room anyway, the quick glances people give something they haven't let go of. In December, Marcus asked how I was thinking about the house long term. Not the house specifically, he said, but the property. Whether it made sense for one man to rattle around in 4 bedrooms. He mentioned a retirement community out past Youngsville that a coworker's mother had moved into and loved. He said he just wanted me thinking ahead. I told him I was exactly where I wanted to be. He said, "Of course, just raising it." I wrote that conversation down in a spiral notebook I'd started keeping that same month. The kind of habit that comes naturally to a man who spent 34 years documenting every circuit he ever wired, because an undocumented job is a liability waiting to happen, and I'd learned that the hard way once, early, and never again after. The notebook ran to 30-some pages by the time things came to a head, and the thing that moved me from watching to acting happened on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 6 weeks before Denise handed me her list. I came home early from a doctor's appointment and found Marcus in my study, sitting at my roll-top desk. The bottom drawer, opened the drawer where I kept the deed, the mortgage payoff letter, the title to both vehicles, and the folder with Yvonne's estate paperwork. He had his phone out, angled down at something in that folder, and he didn't hear me in the doorway. I stood there a second longer than I needed to, just watching, the way you watch a breaker panel before you decide whether to flip anything. Then I said his name, and he startled and slid the phone into his pocket a little too fast, and his face did that thing faces do when they're arranging themselves into something presentable after being caught unprepared. He said he'd been looking for the truck title because he thought the registration might have lapsed and he didn't want to bother me with it. I told him I'd handle my own paperwork, and I'd appreciate him not going through my desk uninvited. He apologized, said it wasn't a big deal. I asked him straight out, "Marcus, what were you taking a picture of?" He said he couldn't remember exactly what page he'd landed on. I looked at him for a good long moment, and he held that easy, sorry expression the way a man holds it when he's had practice holding it. I told him, "Anything you need to know about this house, you ask me. You don't go into my desk." He left the room. I sat there a long while after, thinking about a phone camera aimed at a deed and a mortgage and my dead wife's estate folder, and about a retirement community out past Youngsville, and about Yvonne once telling me, back when she still worked labor and delivery, "You learn everything about a family from what they do when they think nobody's charting it." I called my attorney the next morning. Sam Boudreau had handled my business contracts for 20 years and my personal affairs since Yvonne got sick, and the thing I trusted about Sam was that he told me what was true, not what was easy to hear. I sat in his office and I laid it out for him the way I used to lay out a job for an inspector, dated, factual, no editorializing, because the facts didn't need my opinion stapled to them. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Frank, what outcome do you want here?" I told him I wanted Marcus and Denise out of my house by the end of March, and I wanted it done exactly right under Louisiana law, so there'd be no argument about it later. He explained that as occupants without a lease, they were entitled to notice, and that he'd recommend a full month even though the law allowed less, because a month gave us a record nobody could pick apart. He said, "I'll have the notice to vacate ready by Friday. We'll send it certified, so there's a delivery record." Then he asked if I wanted to try talking to them first, man to man, before it came to paper. I told him I'd had 18 months of talking to them, most of it without either of them realizing that's what it was, and I already knew where that road ended. He said then we'd do the paper properly, and we did. The notice went out certified that Friday. Certified mail leaves a delivery slip if nobody's home to sign, and that slip landed in my mailbox the following Thursday, 2 days before Denise ever sat down to type up her rules. I collected it myself that Thursday afternoon, held it in my hand for a second, and put it right back in the box, because an unclaimed certified slip just sits there waiting, patient as anything, for somebody to come get it. She handed me her list on Saturday morning. I sent her to the mailbox. She came back inside holding that yellow slip, and then, once she'd gone out again to actually collect the letter itself from the post office window, Monday. No, that's not quite right. Let me say it the way it happened. She came back into the kitchen holding the delivery notice, her face moving through about 4 different expressions in under 5 seconds, landing finally on something very still, the look of a woman recalculating a spreadsheet that had just changed underneath her. She set the slip on the counter. She said, "Frank, what is this?" I said, "That's a delivery notice for a certified letter from my attorney. You'll need to sign for it at the post office, but I can tell you what it says. It's a notice to vacate, 30 days. She said, "You can't do this." I said, "I can, and I have, and it's already done. It went out 11 days ago. She looked at the underlined line on her own list, the one about Renee needing 48 hours notice to stay in my house, and then she looked at the slip in her hand, and she said, "Marcus doesn't know about this yet." I said, "He will, the minute you show him." She said, "This is because of the list." And I said, "Denise, I've been watching what's happened in this house for a year and a half. I started writing it down in December. I called Sam Boudreau back in February. The letter went out 11 days ago. You handed me a list of rules this morning. The list isn't why the notice exists. The list is why I sent you to the mailbox this particular morning instead of some other one." I let that sit a second. Then I said, "I wanted you to understand the order things happened in. You handed me your rules for my house. I let you finish. And then I sent you to go get the rules for what's actually going to happen in it." She sat down at the table across from me. She set her own list down next to the delivery slip, and she looked at both of them like she was trying to make them agree with each other and couldn't. I hadn't seen that particular look on Denise's face in 6 years of knowing her, the look of a woman who manages everything, meeting the one thing that wasn't going to let itself be managed. She asked what happened if they didn't leave in 30 days. I told her Sam would file for eviction with the parish court, and the sheriff's department would handle it from there if it came to that, and that I'd rather it not, but that I would, and I wanted her to hear me say plainly that I would. She picked the slip up, set it down, picked up her own list, set that down too. Then she got up and went upstairs, and I heard her on the phone up there a long while, and I sat at that kitchen table and looked at the spice rack, alphabetized the way Yvonne had left it, and thought about the drawer in my study and Marcus with his phone out, and about Yvonne saying you learn a family from what they do when they don't think it's being charted. I'd charted it. 18 months of it, quiet and complete, never once announcing what I was doing while I did it. I'd done what 34 years in the trade taught me to do, which is get the whole picture before you touch a single wire. And the notice on that kitchen table was the touching of the wire. Marcus got home around 6. I was out back working the rose beds, doing the February pruning Yvonne's notebook called for, even though it was 6 weeks late this year on account of everything, and I heard his truck in the driveway, and then I heard the house go quiet in that particular way. A house goes quiet when a conversation's been happening and stops hard the second a door opens. He came out to the garden about 10 minutes later, the delivery slip in his hand, which told me Denise had already shown him she'd been holding it, waiting on his truck, since the moment I'd sent her outside that morning. He stood at the edge of the beds and said, "Dad." I set down my pruning shears. I turned around and looked at my son standing there with that yellow slip in his hand, working through what posture he was going to take into this conversation. He said, "You talked to a lawyer." I said, 6 weeks ago. He said, 6 weeks ago, and you didn't say a word to me. I said, I didn't have a reason to say anything until Denise handed me her rules this morning. He said, so her list is what set this off. I said, her list gave it a date. The decision got made back in February. He said, what happened in February? I said, you were sitting at my desk on a Tuesday with the bottom drawer open and your phone out, taking a picture of something in your mother's estate folder. I came home from the doctor and caught you at it. Something shifted across his face right then, confirming what I'd already been sure of but hadn't been able to prove outright, that Tuesday hadn't been an accident. A man who stumbles into a drawer by mistake apologizes too much and explains too fast. Marcus had done neither. He'd performed calm instead, and it had worked in the moment, but standing in that garden with the slip in his hand, the performance had run out. He didn't say anything for a while. The roses were doing what February roses do down here, which isn't much, just holding on, waiting on March. Finally he said, we can't be out in 30 days. I said, you can. You've both got jobs. 2 working adults can find a place to live in 30 days. That's a solvable problem. What's not solvable is you staying in this house. I don't want you hearing this as anger, because it isn't. It's a decision, and it got made a while back. He asked why it wasn't anger. Honest question, probably the most honest thing he said to me that whole evening. I told him, because anger means I was caught off guard. I wasn't. I've been watching what's gone on in this house since December of last year, and I've had it written down since then. And I went to Sam in February because watching wasn't the right response anymore. None of that's anger. It's just what happens next. He said, you've been keeping notes. I said, 30-some pages, dated, starting last December. He sat down on the little bench Yvonne had put out by the roses back in 2011, the one she said a garden needed, so a person had somewhere to sit and actually look at what they were growing instead of just working at it. He sat there holding that slip in both hands, the way people hold something they're not ready to put down and not ready to act on either. He said, Mom would have talked to me about this first. I said, your mother would have seen it before I did. She'd have talked to you back in 23, and it would have gone different, probably better. I'm not her. I'm slow on the people part of things. But I got there. He looked at the rose beds a long while, at the bare canes waiting on spring, at the one climbing rose along the fence that Yvonne's notebook said would be the first to bud if the winter stayed mild. He said, she planted all this. I said, she planned all of it. Wrote every bit of it down. I'm just following the notebook. He said, you've been following Mom's notebook. I said, since the day she died. He sat with that a minute more, and I didn't rush him, because the evening was doing what February evenings do here, going soft and blue at the edges, and he needed whatever time he needed with it. Then he stood up and went back inside. They left on the 23rd day, not the 30th. I know the count exact because Sam had told me to keep it, in case the move-out date ever got disputed. which it never was. They took what belonged to them and left what belonged to the house, including the spice rack, which had somehow migrated back to alphabetical order sometime in that last week without either of us saying a word about it. Renee drove in from Houston the weekend after they left, walked through the door Friday evening with 2 bags of groceries and an easiness in her shoulders. I hadn't seen on her in over a year the look of somebody who'd been watching a slow problem from 4 hours away and had just watched it resolve the right way. Saturday morning she stood in the kitchen, looked at the spice rack, the arrangement Yvonne called, finished back in whenever it was, and said, "It looks like Mom's kitchen again." I told her, "It looked like your mom's kitchen the whole time, baby. They just piled some things on top of it." She asked if I'd taken the things off. I said I had. We spent Saturday afternoon out at the rose beds, her reading Yvonne's notebook aloud while I did the pruning. The 2 of us out there 3 hours in a February sun that was warmer than it had any right to be, and by the end of it the beds looked the way Yvonne's February entries said they ought to. Renee sat back on her heels and looked at the row and said her mother would have been proud of that stretch of fence. I told her Yvonne always knew exactly what she was doing out there. Renee asked about the list. Did I know, that morning, what was waiting in the mailbox? I told her I'd known since Thursday. The delivery slip had come in Thursday, and I'd walked it right back out to the box and left it be, waiting on the right moment to send somebody after it. She said, "So you were just waiting for her to hand you a reason?" I told her I was waiting for the timing, not the reason. Denise was always going to give me an opening eventually. That's simply who she is. Efficient, right down to the bone. And efficient people can't help themselves. They'll hand you the moment sooner or later because sitting still isn't in them. Her list of house rules was just what that moment happened to look like when it finally showed up. Renee laughed at that, said, "Dad, that might be the most you thing you've ever done in your whole life." I told her Yvonne would have handled it faster. She said, "Mom would have handled it in 2023. I said I knew I was slow on the people part of things, but I got there. She laughed again, and it was Yvonne's laugh. Exact. The same rise at the end of it. And I let that sit out there in the garden a while before either of us said another word. This house on Bayou Terrace is mine. Been mine 30 years now. And it'll stay mine as long as I've got years left in me. And when I'm done with it, it goes to both my children. Equal, documented properly. The way Sam and I set it down last spring when we updated everything. The deed's back in that bottom drawer where it belongs, along with the mortgage papers and Yvonne's estate folder. And nobody's phone is ever going to be pointed at any of it again. The roses are coming in along the fence exactly the way her notebook said they would. The spice rack is alphabetized. The kitchen is finally, and permanently, the way she left it. That's this house. That's what I built here and what I've kept here, and what I protected. Not with shouting, not with a single raised voice with a certified letter, one clear sentence, and a mailbox that had its answer waiting a full 2 days before anybody ever thought to write down a list of rules for me.